Okay, thanks very much, everyone. It's really nice to see you, so many people, on a very late in the term day. In fact, today is the last HEAS seminar for 2023-2024. So we've had some fantastic talks, amazing speakers in our 3 seminar series so far. And it's a great pleasure to introduce the first speaker, and that is Lorena Becerra, Valdivia. She's listed here as the University of Oxford, but I have some very, very good news. Recently, she was appointed as a lecturer in archaeology at the department.
I had the same problem last week. You have to wait a bit.
Could you mute those? Thanks. Thanks. So she was just recently appointed to this new position in Bristol as part of her Lithic Early Career Fellowship. She's taking that position up very soon. So congratulations to you, Lorena. By way of background, Lorena is Chilean, and she did her undergraduate degree at UCLA in the US, and then she came to Oxford to do a Master of Science in Archaeological Science in 2014, 15. Correct? 2014, yeah, I said 2014. Yes, yeah, I got it right. 2014, 15. And then after that, she got a scholarship to do a PhD, DPhil, as it's called, at the University of Oxford on the settlement and colonization of the Americas. And today she's going to be talking about her latest project, which, as I say, has been funded by the Lithic Trust, which is all about the climate role in the settlement process of South America. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Vienna to Lorena. Welcome Lorena to Vienna, and to say how excited we are to have your talk. And I'll hand over to you now, and we'll have some questions at the end for anybody who'd like. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So yeah, I'll get started. Thank you for Tom and everyone made for the organizing and the invitation. Thank you very much. It's been really nice being in Vienna. So I'll get started. I had kept my original slide because I did want to show that I was at Bristol now, although still affiliated with Oxford and the different colleges. But I'll get started. And I had done this in a different format. So if anything looks a bit wonky, it's because it was converted to PowerPoint. So I think it's a bit off. But so I'll get right on it. Like Tom said, I'm currently doing a 3-year Leverhulme project, and the title of this talk is the title of the project that I'm doing, which essentially is looking at the role of abrupt climatic shifts in the initial settlement of South America. In particular, I'll see if this works. Oh, there. So I'm looking at the climatic phases that I'm talking about are the Antarctic cold reversal. So that's happening here. So that's the Bowling Allerage, interstadial 1, roughly equal width, and then the Younger Dryas. So I'm looking at the role of these 2 climatic phases in the settlement of South America. Just to say a bit more as well, if some of you are interested in sort of the earliest, the most initial things in South America, I'm no longer doing that. I did that for my PhD, like Tom said, and I sort of don't want to have anything to do with the earliest and the initial, and like it's really conflictive and controversial. So I'm looking at this particular time period, and this is not an exploratory project, it's a hypothesis-based project. So I'll sort of explain this, and there's information that goes into it. But the hypothesis for the project is that if we see a positive correlation between population expansion and warming in South America, then it's tenable that the earliest South Americans survived during cooling, and then the populations only grew once the temperatures rose. And there's 2 bits of evidence or information that go into this hypothesis, which I have to explain. The first one is that in 2020, we put out this paper with Tom looking at North America. So the study that we saw there did in fact see a positive correlation between the expansion of humans in North America and climatic warming. So that would have happened, it's sort of in this gray here. So that's the last glacial, that's the LGM here. And then in dark gray, that's the Bowling Allerage. In the Northern Hemisphere, that's warming. And then we have the Younger Dryas in the gray here. So in North America, we do see a correlation that's positive between expansion and abrupt warming. The other bit of information is that in South America, what we see in the archaeological record is that humans would have sort of been widespread in the continent later during the Younger Dryas, and this is a paper put out in 2020, and this is what they argue. So this makes sense if you're sort of thinking about the fact that South Americans do come from North America, and it would make sense that we have human expansion in the north happening before, and then it's sort of happening after in South America. What I argue is that although the North American evidence serves to inform the South American record, because it obviously does, this is where South Americans come from, I think that there are potentially other factors that play into it, and one of them is climate. Because we have opposing climatic conditionings happening in North America and in South America. So this could be because of that sort of expansion that we're seeing, or it might also have to do with climate. And this was the whole point of my project, is to sort of test the role of climate. So just a little bit of background, I'm sure that you're all familiar with the bipolar seesaw, which essentially has the temperature changes in the northern and southern hemisphere are inversely related. So in North America, and this is sort of isotopic information coming from the NGRIP, so this is Arctic core ice cores. This is, you see the bowling Allerod, so you see an abrupt warming. So this is sort of deglaciation and truly global warming happening in both hemispheres. You see here in the southern hemisphere. So we have deglaciation after the last glacial maximum, and then in the northern hemisphere we have the bowling Allerod happens, which is this period of abrupt warming. In the southern hemisphere, so this is the Antarctic isotope data coming from the ice core south. We have the opposite. So while the bowling Allerod is happening here and it's warming, in the southern hemisphere and in South America, we have a cold snap. It's not quite going back in a reversal back to glacial conditions, but we see a colder period. And then the same thing when the Younger Dryas, we know in the northern hemisphere, sort of this period of cooling, and the southern hemisphere, we see the opposite. So we see evidence of deglaciation and temperature increases. So what I was arguing is that the settlement in South America, this might have sort of played a role, the differences, the opposing differences in climatic conditions. A little bit more background, we know now that I've talked about the Antarctic cold reversal, which is sort of is happening before the Younger Dryas. It's not very straightforward. So the archaeological record is not straightforward, but paleoclimatic evidence is also not straightforward, which complicates things when you're trying to conclude neat things. But just to give you a bit of background, the ACR is not like it's felt uniformly throughout South America. It's an event that's coming out of Antarctica. So there's a south to north gradient. So there was this study in 2016 that came out that looked at nearly, I think, 100 southern hemisphere paleoclimate records. And what they essentially said at the end is that there's a strong ACR signal south of 40 degrees south. They categorize everything between 40 and 20 as unclear, and 20 degrees high, so towards the equator, it's a green-like signal. So it's essentially looking more like the northern hemisphere signal, right? So there's a south to north gradient. It's not quite straightforward, and we'll talk about this a bit more because there's more evidence coming out, for example, looking at glacier advance that's, sort of a bit shy of 20 degrees south. So it's really patchy and it's not, but at least if we can keep this sort of gradient in mind when we're analyzing the results, this is good to know. So just to go back to my project, and number 2 should be bold. These were the objectives of the project: to get new archaeological radiocarbon dates. So I'm an archaeological scientist and a radiocarbon dating specialist. So getting new dates to increase sort of the resolution of the cultural timeline, and then create a human activity timeline using Bayesian modeling. And then the third point was, and it still is, just then synthesize paleo-environmental records. And then finally to then synchronize human and paleoclimate. So one of the things that allows us to sort of connect cultural and climatic timelines is chronology, right? So the length of time, essentially. And today, what I'm only going to focus on is that number 2. So it's this human activity timeline that I've created, and I'll show you what the results show, and if there is a role that these climatic phases are actually playing in South America. So just a little bit on the methods that I use. I'm not going to go into any of them really, but mainly radiocarbon dating, data compilation, and then Bayesian modeling. I'm not going to go into what radiocarbon dating is, and some of you here are experts on this, but I will say this, that the project is looking at radiocarbon dating brand new sites in South America, so in places like Chile, where I'm from, but then also increasing the resolution of really important sites. So this is a site called Tequendama in Colombia, and the dating of anything sort of in Colombia and in that region is really important because often we're unable to date things there because of the high temperature, the humidity. So getting anything from this region is really, really quite important. And in the past, they've often failed at dating things from Colombia, for example. So this is a sequence that I've worked on with Michael Sigler. He's at the Max Planck. He's a brilliant PhD student. And essentially, this is a site that was sort of already dated, but we've done more radiocarbon dating to increase the resolution of it for us to get really good control on the chronology at the site. In terms of data compilation, I have about 150 archaeological sites in over 1,000 days. And I'll just mention, because I'm a radiocarbon specialist, the focus of data compilation is not only on the archaeological stuff, it's also on the radiocarbon data aspect of things. So there's a lot of values that act as quality control for us in radiocarbon that allow us to assess the reliability of dates, like CN ratios for bone collagen, carbon yield, collagen yield, etc. That again allows to sort of assess the quality of the date. So I'm also compiling that, and you'll see how unreported that data generally is. And this is sort of a bit of a call to archaeologists out there to publish your radiocarbon data because it's really informative and useful. And for labs also to release that information and to report that information to their customers. Because generally, I think it's not just the case here, that data is largely unreported, I think you will find. But it's really important. With Bayesian modeling, I'm also not going to go into it, but just quite briefly, it involves the integration of essentially radiocarbon dates or chronometric information with the archaeological context in archaeology. So in that sense, the archaeological context and the information is the prior. So that's what I'm feeding the model. That's the information that I'm using to feed the model and to build the model. So you can use different priors in archaeology even. The one that I often use is stratigraphy. So yeah, that's a bit clunky. But this is an idealized archaeological site, essentially, where we have the bottom of the sequence, where phase C is older than phase B than phase A, right? So that's like a very idealized archaeological site, and that's stratigraphy. So that ordering, essentially, stratigraphic ordering is what I'm using to build my Bayesian models. And that's usually what we're doing when we're doing archaeological applications with Bayesian modeling. So in that sense, I'm able to tell the model, well, there's a phase C that corresponds to layer C, and that layers E and F will go into this grouping, and that these states should be older than the ones date, C and D that belong to this other phase. So that information, that ordering is what I'm using in Bayesian modeling. So hopefully that makes sense, and it's quite sort of straightforward. And the more simplistic and the more conservative your Bayesian model is, usually it's the best. I always say this, and I teach this in classes, that Bayesian modeling, to me, Tom might disagree, I don't know, allows us to do three things. The first one is at the very basic level. It allows us, again, to integrate archaeological and chronometric data. And for any students out there, this is really, really information. Your radiocarbon measurement is essentially an isotope ratio. And it might not necessarily be dating the cultural event that you're interested in targeting, right? So I might not necessarily with this bone artifact be interested in knowing when that organism, let's say a cow, died, because that's what your radiocarbon measurement is telling you. I'm interested in when this was made into a bone artifact, or when the bone artifact was put in a burial. So it's always really important to think of any chronometric data in the context of your archaeological site, your archaeological context. It might be that all of those events overlap, and it might be that it's not the case. So it's always really important to integrate your radiocarbon dates with your archaeological context, and know what you're actually trying to target when you get a date back, or what the results mean. The second thing that it allows us to do, sort of the next step, is to assess archaeological sequences. So this is, again, the Colombian site, and we have the face of the base of the site, and then it goes up in time. So we have a chronology sort of going up in time. So it allows us to put the archaeological data within the archaeological and the chronometric data within the statistical framework. If we use outlier analysis, for example, we're able to automatically and objectively identify outliers and downweight them within the sequence. And often people will discard outliers that they don't make sense with archaeology. I'm just going to get rid of them. But putting them within this sort of phase and in outlier analysis, it allows us to be sort of transparent, to show all the data. They're going to get downweighted anyways, according to the degree of offset. So it's quite informative, and outliers themselves are informative. They might be telling you about vertical mixing within a sequence, bioturbation, pre-treatment issues as well, if we have incomplete decontamination of the sample. So they are informative. And so again, Bayesian modeling allows us to put all of this within a statistical framework. The last thing, which is again the next step, is that it allows us to correlate multiple sites across time and space. And this is an example from Tom's work and Katarina's in 2014, when they were looking at the degree of overlap between Neanderthals and modern humans in Eurasia. So what they were able to do is that out of, I think you did maybe 40 sites, in this case, they estimated the end of the Mysterian for all of those sites, and the Mysterian is associated with Neanderthals. And so they were able to put all of that into a sequence and ultimately estimate the end of the Mysterian for the region. So linking multiple sites and being able to obtain important information that allows you to sort of look at large scale spatial temporal patterns, right? And if you have the end of the Mysterian, you can also calculate the end of the Aurignacian, which is associated to modern humans. And then you can quantify the degree of overlap between the two. So again, this is sort of it's the three things that I think Bayesian modeling allows us to do. And this, the last bit, and sort of all of this is essentially what I used when I looked in North America and what I'm using now. So it's sort of this approach of what we call sort of chronology building. So we don't have Aurignacian and Mysterian in South America, but there are a number of other lithic traditions. So here, and sort of happening at around the same time, a bit earlier, a bit later, but generally this is what's happening. So we have uniphase technologies, they're the ones that I put in the up top, and then we have a number of bifacial point technologies happening here, the ones in the bottom. It's not very straightforward, but it's nice. At different sites, we might have multiple technologies happening at the same time. So we might have a site in Peru that has bifan points. Yeah, this is all shifted. It's like the formatting. But these are bifan points here. And we also have some like fell points happening at the same site in the same context. I'm not a lithicist, so sometimes when I'm trying to look at how I'm going to categorize a certain site, it's quite complicated. And I used to have a quote that I took out here, but essentially different archaeologists do different things. So some projectile points might just be called what one archaeologist might just call a projectile point. Someone else might call it, you know, a fishtail. And there's like clumping and like splitters. So it's a bit complicated as a non-lithicist to sort of look at. But this is sort of what's going on in terms of cultural traditions in South America, just to give you a little bit of background. This is really like text heavy, so I'm really sorry. But there's a couple of rules to the modeling and the work that I did. And you don't have to read all this, but in terms of the calibration, for example, so in South America, we have a northern hemisphere air masses. So you do have to look at sort of using two calibration curves at the same time, because we have a mixing of air masses. So that's some rules going into that. The important bits of the last points here that talk about the Bayesian modeling. So there's three categories of sites that I looked at or that ended up being analyzed. The first one is that if there was a site with multiple measurements and multiple stratigraphic levels, then a multi-phase model was produced. That makes sense because there's different phases. The second one is that if a site was represented by only one radiocarbon date, there was no more information, the site is represented by that one radiocarbon date. And then finally, if a site was represented by two or more, then I did a single phase model. This might not mean anything to all of you. I think it makes sense to Tom. But just, there's three different types of sites that I put into my models. And I'm gonna jump straight into the results. I think I'm okay with time. In terms of the database, like I said, about 150 sites over 1,000 ages, and focusing on that radiocarbon data as well, apart from the archaeological context. And this is not surprising, most of the dates are radiocarbon dates. Okay, and that's why it's also important to try to get that radiocarbon information out. Just a bit of an analysis, there are definitely biases, and I think this is the case everywhere. And we're dealing with an archaeological record that's a pixelated record, so there's always something happening. But this is a count of sites per country and a count of measurements per country. So you see that perhaps some countries like Brazil, Chile, and Argentina have been more prolific. And there's countries that are entirely underrepresented. So I think it's not just a point of sort of preservation of archaeological material. This is not what is happening, is that there's research and funding biases happening in South America. And perhaps in certain countries, it might get worse with the current political situations. So there's definitely biases in the continent. The other thing is that there's massive reporting issues, again, with the data, and it makes it complicated, and I'll come to the conclusion, to assess the reliability of the date. And if you can't assess the reliability of the date, there's a lot, you can't be so certain in terms of sort of accuracy. And accuracy is more important because how is it shifting your timeline? But this is sort of the good news. Out of all the samples, the green is good news. Most of material types are reported in the data, which is good. Of all the radiocarbon ages, most of them, at least more than half, are wood charcoal samples, and that's important for something else. A couple more good news. Most of the time the laboratory codes are reported. I just want to look at the ones that were reported, which were the labs that were most represented in South America. And it makes sense that the top 3 are North American, and then we have some European sites, with Beta being the lead. This is not surprising. I just wanted to have a look at that as a radiocarbon dating specialist, but also it's a bit of a shame because there are 2 AMS labs in Latin America that are completely not represented. So I think there are radiocarbon labs in Latin America that are underutilized by South American folks, and that might be because of funding situations. But I hope that we get to see an increase in the use of these labs. And I have a close relationship with both of those labs. It's in Brazil and Mexico, and they're really nice labs. So I hope that we can sort of use them more in South America. Now, on to the bad news. Out of all of the charcoal radiocarbon date samples, most of the time the species, it's not reported. And so generally in sort of the literature analysis that I did, inbuilt age issues when it comes to wood charcoal samples is not considered or addressed or talked about. So that's when if you have sort of, for example, long living species like wood tree species, you might introduce, essentially your dates are sort of older than what they should be because that tree lived a very long time ago. So this can be sort of placated if you're doing analysis and you have someone doing an identification of your species so that you know that wood charcoal came from a short-lived species, or if you have someone that might identify bark, which means that the tree could have been old, but at least you have the bark, which is sort of the youngest. So that generally is not talked about, and this could introduce sort of inaccuracies in the timeline. More about news. Generally, pre-treatment type in radiocarbon dating is not reported, and this is important for us again to sort of assess the radiocarbon dates themselves. Species overall is generally not recorded or reported. Delta 13C values is not generally reported. That's not that important. Percent carbon values are not reported. That's more important. So if you send me a wood charcoal sample and the carbon yield comes out to be something like 15%, what you sent me is not wood charcoal. Wood charcoal should be considerably higher. So it's important for us to know this information so that we can assess, again, the reliability of the data. More sort of bad news. CN ratios are really important for us when we do bone collagen. They allow us to see if there might be any issues with contamination. So the accepted threshold is something like what, 2.9 to 3.5. Generally unreported. So really, I have no idea if your bone collagen date is reliable or not. Generally, of the 28 that were reported, they fall within that threshold, as you can see here. Now, that might be because there are no contamination issues in the bone collagen, or it might be that there is quality control criteria that's being taken up by the lab. So often labs, if the CN ratio is something crazy, very high, They'll look into it, they'll try to redate it, and that date might ultimately not be reported because it's not considered to be reliable. So this might be one of two things. That's just me. I think some of these are Oxford as well, and Oxford wouldn't report something that's crazy. So something to keep in mind. So let's move on to the sort of the modeling results. I think I'm okay with time. Yeah. So these were the three categories that I told you in terms of the type of site that I had. So most of the time I have the sort of most represented category are sites that are represented by one age, and they're all of the ones here in black. So that's 55 sites that are represented, or cultural components that are represented by one age. That's not surprising. There are funding issues in South America, and I've worked with archaeologists there who often, if they might have a stratified site, they don't necessarily have the funding to do really sort of sequential radiocarbon dating. So they'll get 1 or 2 dates, and that's the best they can do. So that's not surprising at all. The second category is in orange, 39 sites that I was able to do a multi-phase model. So stratified sites that have sites sort of for all, if not most of the layers. And then finally, these single phase sites, that's 37 of them. I wanted to sort of look at the spatial temporal aspect of things by categorizing things into different categories. So one of them you'll see here is lithic technology, seeing if, you know, something like what Tom did in Eurasia, what I did in North America, can we see any patterns by looking at the lithic industries? The second one is province. That might be the most important because we have that south to north gradient in terms of the ACR. Then I wanted to look at the sites that are high altitude, so anything higher than 2,500 meters, and then sites that have evidence of megafaunal kill or scavenging, just to look at sort of the role of humans, climate, and megafaunal extinctions happening at the time. So we'll start with the first category, and it's the one that I think is the least meaningful and doesn't tell me much. So spoilers. This is a GIF. It's essentially going from, it's all the distributions categorized. So all the cultural components categorized by the lithic technology you'll see here. And it goes 200 years before the ACR and 200 years after the Younger Dryas. I was able to stop it and start it in Keynote, and I can't do that now. So I can't just play it for you. The other thing is that the circles are growing in terms of probability. So usually you have an age range, and it might be like a normal distribution. So your circle is small here and it goes bigger and smaller. So that's what the circles are doing. It's according to your probability. You can't really see much of anything, actually. You can't now because there's a couple seconds, but I have looked at it long and hard and you can't see much of a pattern. So perhaps what makes sense is to sort of look at the estimated start for the different lithic technologies. So these are putting all of these cultural components or archaeological sites according to their different categories. So when I saw this, I was also a bit like, I don't see much of anything. So this is quite clearly a progression, and I've left the ACR and the Younger Dryas at the top of every slide, so you can sort of have a frame, a reference point, essentially. You can see a progression that goes before the ACR past the Younger Dryas. What you see here in blue are all of the technologies that are bifacial point technologies, and a bit pinkish, they're the uniphase technologies. And then at the top, we have everything that's categorized as just either uniphase or biphase. There isn't much of a pattern. What you can see is some of the distributions are really wide. So something to keep in mind that sometimes uncertainties in archaeology or in chronometry don't allow us to answer the questions that we want answered. So uncertainties is a massive thing. But you don't really see much of a sort of a pattern here. What I did want to look at, for example, because there is that ambiguity in what some people might call this type of projectile point and this other type, I just wanted to look at when we had the start of bifacial point technology. So that's me grouping all of the blue ones into one distribution, and point, that's why the distribution, it's a lot sort of more precise because it has a lot more data that's going into it. And so essentially what I can say here, if this comes out quite slowly, is that bifacial point technology in the continent seems to begin before or during the ACR. That's it. Is there a meaningful, and a lot of you are archaeologists, I don't think that necessarily bifacial means later and more sophisticated. It's all about sort of adaptation and what's being used at the time. So I actually don't think that this tells me anything that meaningful, apart from perhaps sort of this bit of information I was able to pull out. The other category that I wanted to look at, which is perhaps again more important, and I'm sorry I can't stop it because it's a bit distracting, is provinces. So I just went off sort of these geographical provinces off of this book here. So we have the Andes going up here, so it's quite a long stretch of land. So I have split it in between northern, central, and southern Andes. We have the Patagonian plateaus, the Paraguay-Paraná lowlands, Brazilian highlands, Amazonian lowlands. And what you'll see here, for example, is the entire Amazon is entirely underrepresented. So here you have essentially the same GIF according to provinces. So you see that there's nothing showing up here. There's one site that's representing the Amazonian lowlands. That's it. And if you take a look at this, you actually will see that there also isn't much of a pattern that you can look at if you look at sort of a time slice like this. So what does it tell us if we look at the estimated start of the cultural components according to each province? So here there's a bit more of a pattern. First of all, everything, if you see, is starting before or during the ACR, apart from the Amazonian lowlands, but that's represented by one data point. So your sample size is really small. So we're not going to look at that. But it's quite interesting that everything is sort of happening during the ACR and before the ACR, even the provinces that are really south. I would have expected maybe not to see that in the south of South America, because that's where the impact of the ACR and the cold snap would have felt more strongly. But we have humans during the ACR in the south of South America, in areas like Patagonia, Paraná, and then in the southern Andes, well before the ACR. So if you see here, we have the southern Andes and the central Andes starting before. There's a bit of a gap, and then we have the rest of the distributions. So there's something happening there. So what we're able to say here at least is the southernmost occupation. And this is me taking the southern Andes, the Patagonian Plateau, and to an extent the Paraguay-Paraná lowlands. Those are the sort of more south provinces. They're happening before or during the ACR. Not what I expected to see. But that's the pattern that emerges. The other thing that I wanted to look at is because I'm Chilean, those of you who know Chile, Chile is really long. And that's representing that, I think, in Peru, might be in Argentina, representing the southern Andes. So I wanted to take out the sides from the southern Andes distribution that I'll poleward, so like south of 40 degrees south. And is it telling me the same thing? And it's telling me the same thing. So that pink distribution that came up now is just those sites that are south of 40 degrees south. So they're the southern sites of the southern Andes. And we see the same thing. So we do have human occupation starting before and during the ACR, which is not what I expected. So if we look at this a little bit more, so this is again the southern occupation of South America. If you might see, there's a bit of a gap potentially between the southern Andes and the Patagonian and the Paraná. That seems to be an east-west pattern. So sort of what we have here is early occupation happening west of the Andes. And then we have a bit of a gap, and then we have occupation east of the Andes. So sort of think of it like Chile and then Argentina. Because we put everything again within a statistical framework, I can test that and actually look and see statistically, is there a gap between those distributions? So there is a gap between the two distributions that lasts up to about 1,300 years at 68 CI. And that falls within sort of like before and during the ACR. So there is a gap. So what we can say here, some pattern, is that there is a likely west earlier versus east later pattern in the southernmost region. So why is that? Why do we see this pattern? There's two reasons really that you can look at. One of them is the climate and the environment, and then the next one would be sort of the cultural pattern. The first one is the climate and the environment. Lumila is Argentinian, I'm Chilean. We know this, some of you might not know this, but there's different climate regions and climate sort of conditions or drivers affecting South America, of course, and everything. One of them is really important when we're looking at this time period, is the southwesterly winds. So the southwesterly winds are sort of in this belt here. They're coming from the South Pacific, and they're sort of moving this way, hitting South America. They bring in moisture and precipitation from the South Pacific. Okay. But there's also climatically a west to east antiphase because of the rain shadow effect, essentially. So they're bringing moisture and precipitation, which makes the Chilean side of Patagonia, let's say, really wet. So it's wet and cold. And to the east, it's cold and dry. So climatically, there's an antiphase because of the rain shadow effect, which essentially means that as soon as the precipitation hits the Andes, it rains out. So the air masses be sort of past Chile, they're dry. And you have rain shadow effects in other places, I think maybe in New Zealand or Tasmania. Yeah, so this happens, right? So could it be the climate and the environment that's driving the sort of east to west that we're seeing? Perhaps as a factor. The other thing, which I think is most likely, is the fact that we have earlier cultural evidence in the Andes and west of the Andes. So this is just a couple of the sites that are sort of earlier to the period that I'm looking at in South America. And so in South America, we see the earliest sort of traces of human activity reported in places like the Northern Andes, like Taima or Cuenca, so Colombia, Venezuela. In the Brazilian highlands, there's sites that are reported to be a lot, LGM aged. And then in the Southern Andes, so we have evidence from Pilarco or Monteverde, that's a lot older. So Southern Andes, we have humans in the Southern Andes before we have humans in sort of the Argentinian Patagonia and the Paraná lowlands. So I think climate environment maybe played a role, but I think it's just most likely the fact that we already had humans. So I think I conclude here that the pattern is most likely explained by the distribution of the pre-existing population. And there's implications I'll discuss about this in a bit. Finally, not finally, I hope I'm doing a pretty good time. Yeah? Okay, cool. I wanted to look at the Patagonian Plateau because that's sort of a region that I really expected to be impacted by the ACR, and I didn't expect to have humans sort of, or the estimated of commencement of cultural activity at the period during the ACR, and this is the distribution here represented. So I wanted to look at glacier activity. So what's sort of the climate, what's happening in the climate and the environment? So let's look at some glacier evidence. So I looked at some different sort of studies. Here is a study looking at sort of this region. So the archaeological site that I've looked at here, this is here, but it's close enough. And what this paper is showing is that there was glacier re-advance in central Patagonia during the ACR. All good, that's expected. Just note though, and this is, I guess, if they're students, again, uncertainties are really important to think about. The 13K is a means of centrality. That's a median or a mean, because that's their uncertainty, the moraine ages. That covers the younger Dryas and the ACR. So they're hitting a central point. Okay, so important to not just, I often work with sort of paleoclimate and paleoenvironmental scientists who sometimes, oh, archaeology. But I mean, you're doing stuff like this as well. So that's something important to keep in mind. This is on YouTube, isn't it? I really like working with you. This is another study in Torres del Paine. So this is this sort of small region there in black. And this again is looking at glacier re-advance in the region, sort of at the start and at the end of the ACR. Fine, that's what's expected. Now, what comes next is, again, everything is not straightforward, uniform, homogeneous. There's also evidence of re-advance at or shortly after the younger Dryas. So it's not like the ACR happened in the region that should be glaciated. All of the glaciers re-advanced during the ACR and during this cold snap. Glacier re-advancement is spotty in Patagonia as well. So it's not so far-fetched to think that humans were able to sort of live and thrive there. It wasn't necessarily the whole region was glaciated. The glaciers didn't sort of snap and come back. The evidence is a bit spotty as well. So important to also look at what's happening with the climate and the environment. This is another category. So I wanted to look at high altitude sites because the same thing in Patagonia, high altitude sites are going to be most impacted by a cold snap in the ACR. So you can see here that, of course, they're mostly concentrated. They're the ones in purple in the Andes, right? So that's the region of sort of high altitude that we have in South America. That's the distribution. That's the estimated start of high altitude occupation in South America. And you can see here that the occupation of high altitude sites commences during or immediately after the ACR. So again, we have humans during the ACR in really high altitude regions. So also not what I expected, but it's sort of a similar thing to what's happening in the southernmost region, which I thought was going to be most affected. That's interesting. I wanted to look at glacier evidence again in the Andes. So this is glacier evidence in northern and central Andes. So this is like Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. What they were saying here is that 60% of the glaciers recorded advancement during the ACR. That's all good, but important to point out, and I don't know if I put it out here or not. There's also that's only 60%. There's also re-advancement during the younger dryas. So it's the same thing. It's not like it's all uniform and sort of happening at the same time. It's there's a heterogeneous sort of pattern. This is going a bit more south. So this is hitting Argentina here at 27 degrees south there. And what they were able to say is that there's advancement during the ACR, during the younger dryas, and sometimes there are advancement sort of more north of what that paper estimated. So they would put advancement in that region that was considered to be unclear signals, so maybe missed signals. So again, we do have glacier re-advancement quite far north. Now, what the driver of that re-advancement might be, is it cold conditions or is it increased precipitation? Because there's multiple drivers when it comes to climate. It might not be the cold, but it might just be an increase in precipitation. But again, it's just sort of happening throughout. It's not very uniform. Now, finally, the last bit of information I wanted to look at is the sites that have direct evidence of megafauna kill and scavenging, because as you all know, sort of in this time period, I think in South America saw the most number of sort of genera that went extinct in the whole of the planet, I think. Way more than in North America. So I wanted to look at the interaction between humans and climate in megafauna. So you can see here again as a GIF, and you'll see that the distribution of sites with megafaunal kill and scavenging evidence spread throughout. What's interesting and estimated the start of this activity, this is well before the ACR. So we have human interaction with megafauna happening before the ACR in South America. So just to give you a little bit more background, these are the different groups or sort of genera that are reflected in those sites with direct sort of human involvement. So we mostly see horses, mastodon, ground sloths, and camelids. So yeah, frequency of megafauna exploitation by humans. This is a paper that came out in 2022. I have a couple more sites, but this is pretty up to date with what's being represented. So if you grab these groups here, and you take the last appearance dates, how do they relate with the evidence that I just showed you? So these are last appearance dates for all of those different species that we just saw. And you can see they sort of, go from sort of the ACR well into the early Holocene, those last appearance dates. So what I can say, because I know that we see evidence for the start of human involvement with megafauna, is that megafaunal kill and scavenging begins considerably earlier, thousands at some points, than some of these last appearance dates for extinct genera. So can I say that humans were to blame for human or faunal extinctions in South America? I don't think with any degree of certainty. Also, I always argue that last appearance dates are useful proxies, but I think the most important or the more informative estimation would be the commencement of the decline of each species or group. That's more important. And that's a study that it's a completely different sort of, someone should do a PhD on that. I haven't found a paper. If you know of a paper that does this in South America, let me know. So really it's imperfect data for me to sort of compare. It's a bit like apples and oranges, and it's not very informative. But based on the sort of crappy data that I do have, I can't really say much of anything. I know that humans were killing them well before we see them last in the radiocarbon record. So now on to conclusions, which I think is good timing. In terms of the databasing, there is poor reporting. So as a radiocarbon dating specialist, I can't really assess the radiocarbon dates. Does it matter? In radiocarbon dating terms, it's sort of considered, it's relatively young period. So the issues that like Tom has to contend with, for example, looking at the middle to upper Paleolithic transition, that's a period that's hitting sort of the edge of radiocarbon. And he has to worry about better pretreatment methods, harsher decontamination method, more expensive methods to get the contamination out of his samples. I'm in a period that's a lot younger, and contamination, I want to be careful because I don't want for people to think that contamination doesn't matter. Modern contamination matters a bit less because the period is more modern, if that makes sense. So does it matter? Maybe less important. Also, there's limited anthropological data. So that's identifying the species of the wood charcoal, for example, which means that inbuilt age is not addressed. And so if we have dates that are sort of older than they should be, the whole accuracy of our timeline might suffer, right? Biases, there should definitely further research in currently underrepresented regions. One of my last projects was looking at the Amazon, and I felt a bit like embarrassed because even as a South American, I didn't know the degree of sort of monumentality that was happening in the Amazon. Like they were really modifying their landscape in Amazonia, building canals and massive structures. I didn't even know that. Generally, it's been thought to be the sort of culturally sterile environment that nothing much went on. It's not the case at all. So I think, you know, something in the Amazon in the future might completely change what we know in terms of everything in South America. It just hasn't been looked at as much as it should be. And then so what I'm able to say is that in terms of archaeology, it's often what matters more, the archaeological context or the radiocarbon, the reliability of the archaeology or the chronometry. I think what matters here most is not necessarily the chronometry, but the archaeology. Good reporting in the archaeology and also complete studies. So doing like identifying the species of your wood charcoal to know if you have inbuilt age, reporting everything. So not just radiocarbon, but you know, not just archaeology, but also radiocarbon. I think that's more important in South America. And then also, you know, research biases will have the most impact on the reliability of the timeline. So it's those two things. And then, so to answer my question, and I sort of answered it before I thought I was going to answer it, to be honest with you, that the ACR and the Younger Dryas play an important role in the human settlements of South America. I don't think so. It's not very deterministic. Humans, as we saw, were present in areas most affected by cold temperatures, like the southernmost region and the high altitude during the ACR. So I think not so much. So I sort of answered my question. And then the likely explanations is that humans were already present in the region, likely in low density, well adapted groups with evidence for megafauna hunting and bifacial pond technology prior to or during the ACR. Also, one of the explanations is that the climatic shifts in the southern hemisphere, or at least in South America, were a lot less drastic to what was happening in North America. And I'll finish by showing you a bit of this. So this is a study that came out in 2019 that looked at changes in surface air temperature during the ACR. And you can see that they're a lot less drastic, the changes in temperature in South America than in North America. So you see here in red, these are simulated, so modeled air, surface air temperature changes in North America in red, or yeah, Northern Hemisphere in red. And you can see the jump essentially during the Bowling Allerod. And this is, you know, a difference between, this is a 3-degree difference. But if you go to South America in blue, it's sort of like maybe a bit more than a 0.5 difference. So it's a lot less drastic in the Southern Hemisphere than in the Northern Hemisphere. You sort of have happy deglaciation, and then you see a massive increase of temperature in the north. And you can see that here. So that's the Bowling Allerod happening in North America, and that's the ACR happening in South America. So climatic shifts were less drastic in South America. This is using a different sort of climate model. I wanted to look at the Trace 21K for those of you who are familiar with paleoclimate models. This is different from the last study. This is essentially showing the same thing. So what I've plotted here is the annual mean temperature during the ACR relative to the 15K. 15K is that point before all the changes happen. And what you can see here is that in North America, we have a difference in certain areas or an increase of 13 degrees in temperature. In South America, we go down 3.7. So the difference in temperature was a lot less drastic in South America. So I think that also played a role. The less than drastic climatic conditions in South America played a role in what I see here, which I didn't see in North America. In North America, we saw that human expansion, it's also supported by DNA evidence. It's happening during warming, which is not so far-fetched to sort of come to that conclusion. In South America, I don't see that as you saw, but I think this is an aspect of it. Do the patterns have, this is the stuff that like people go crazy online, but do the patterns have implications for the initial settlement in South America, which is what I said I didn't want to get into, but I think it might do a little bit, because we have this like east to west antiphase culturally that we saw here, for example. I think the Andes and river basins like the Amazon basin were likely key dispersal routes in South America. So genetically, we know that as soon as like humans went down to South America really quickly. I think that it's not far-fetched, and some people might have said that as well, that the Andes played the role of like a funnel. So humans went down quite quickly. So we see human evidence before here than there. And I think river basins that essentially the Amazon starts, the source is in the Andes. I think those river basins were used as routes, essentially, because we have early human evidence in the Brazilian highlands here. And also, I think there's some genetic evidence that might come out that shows the role of sort of like rivers and the settlement of South America. So I think the Andes and the river basins are quite important. And then what's next? I'm still synthesizing all the paleoenvironmental records. So these are records here like low resolution records like pollen. So looking at vegetation and fire regime here, and then compare them to more high resolution records like speleothem records. And that I'm doing this work with my colleague Heidi Cad, which is sort of synthesizing everything, looking at change point analysis. If you look at different sort of, for example, pollen records, they really have poor resolution, a lot of them. So if you start summarizing them, they pick up the resolution of your lowest resolution record. So a summarized curve is not the best idea. What we want to do here, and what she did in Australia, looking at the LGN, is looking at change point analysis. So looking at all those records and looking at the point at which they change. So vegetation changes. That estimate might be more meaningful than looking at a summarized curve. And then finally, we're going to look at sort of, this is a separate paper, look at what we do with synthesizing the paleoclimate records with the paleoclimate models like the Trace 21K, which I showed you. So how does our proxy data compare to the simulated modeled climate data? So this is a separate. And what I want to do here is I want to pay a bit more attention to high altitude records and Patagonian records, because I want to see if they can inform the results I got from my analysis. And that's it, actually. So I just want to thank my funding bodies, and then Tom and you guys for inviting me, and then all of these people who chat with me about my work.